Hey guys! So today you and I are going to talk about testing tools. So let's get into it. So the question in question was, hi Frederick, what according to you are the best full stack software testing tools for testing both front end and back end? Well, let's start by talking about the first theoretical tool that you're going to need, which is the trickiest one for a lot of software developers to get, which is the testing pyramid. So the reason why I sort of advocate for that is I made a video not that long ago actually about exactly why I believe that if you're going to create a testing strategy or something like that, then it's pretty important for you to think about the testing pyramid, simply because it's probably the easiest mental model that you can have for figuring out what type of test to write for what given situation and for what type of code that you're going to deal with. But if we sort of gloss over the fact that that's a tool that you probably should know about and learn the theory about it so that you can figure out which tools to use. Now I'm going to shortcut it a little bit here, and I'm going to tell you the tools that I use for what sort of situations. And then I want you to sort of in the back of your head remember that the reason why I know that this is a good tool for that given situation is because it correlates to the testing pyramid. It is because I've learned how to test in different layers and what test to put where, because if you understand how that pyramid is structured and the basics behind it, you will also know when to use one of my tools. Or you can just cheat and just copy everything I do, but that's not going to help you for some situations because testing is a lot more complicated than what I will be able to cover here in my little video. But let's start. So let's talk about front-end first and foremost. So when it comes to front-end development, depending on what front-end framework, because I'm just going to assume now that you're using something like React, Angular, Vue, or something like that. But if you're not, it's still sort of relevant because that becomes a separate sort of thing. Because if you're going to talk like if you're using, I don't know, like most static HTML pages and you're using something like jQuery or just vanilla JavaScript or something like that, it's slightly different, but the same basic rules still apply. My favorite tool these days is going to be vtest, because basically when we're running Vite and vtest together, that's a pretty good combination. Before that, I usually used Jest for most things. And if I'm completely honest with you, I still sort of fall back to that again, because if I'm not using a Vite thing or something like which I mostly do these days, then it's old school. And before I used Jest, I used Mocha. And for people who do Angular, you have like Jasmine and Karma and like these sort of combinations. But a unit test runner of some sort for the front end. Now the reason why I want to use that is because when I develop components, visual components, the thing that I'm trying to do as quickly as possible is just to write some basic tests to make sure that all the interactions are working. So clicking, hovering, or like selecting things or having things show conditionally and stuff like that. These basic sort of operations, they are super important to do at the unit test level, if you ask me at the very least, because it sort of saves you time when you get higher up and more you use to like larger scoped tools that we're going to talk about. But that is the reason that I use it. And then of course I always love, which is a practice I can only warmly recommend, to extract out any type of logic that I might have in my components. It doesn't matter what UI framework you're using, right? If you can understand that, if you can make that separation between what's in the component code and then what the actual logic, like might use some data transforms or something like that, right? If you put that as a separate function, then you don't really need to add the testing logic on top of the component, just like test, something like what items are in a select drop down or stuff like that. Because if you just have that extracted out, then you know that if you've tested the base cases, the basic simulated cases, as I was talking about for the UI component, then you can write a separate unit test just for the function. And that is a very nice separation. You can almost think about it a little bit like, I'm not sure if you PHP people remember back in the day when we didn't really have a really clean-cut MVC type of thing where you put like SQL queries in the middle of the HTML. Same deal here. Just separate the view part, like dumb component doing some type of interactions, from the data and the logic, and then test those things in isolation, if at all possible. That's what I like. And then make sure, like, if you're gonna use Jest or VTest or something like that, like, get yourself a mocking framework, because mocking and stubbing is like bread and butter stuff. You're going to need it. I promise you, you're going to need it at some point, because it's a hassle to always have to deal with, other components or other logic and stuff, like, especially if you're going to do like an external network call. Like, you want to mock things like fetching and stuff like that, or if you're using Axios, I'm not sure. Right, that's the first layer of the pyramid taken care of, like the basic tools at the very least that I usually use for unit testing. So next layer, all right, so what's that gonna be in a very simple application? Well, it's gonna be some type of visual regression testing or something like that. That's what I will look at. So what I like to do for visual regression testing is that either I use a service like Percy.io is popular, or something similar. Another one that I had a project that I really liked, which was it was a simple project, but it was called Loki. I think they deprecated it now. It might still be running, like some people are still contributed to it, but honestly I'm thinking more and more that I'll just re-implement it myself. And the basic idea is that if you use something like, say, Storybook, which is something that I like to use, well, I'm not going to say that I like to use it, it's just that it's the easiest thing that I can reach for to fulfill my needs, and it does have the necessary plugins that I need, so I don't have to write everything from scratch myself. But the basic idea behind it is that I create my UI components, as I was saying, like I separate the business logic from the components so that I can just mount the component with like inputs like click functions, data, whatever, so I can mock any data I want, so the visual part is isolated. Because when I do that, it's very easy for me to put that into Storybook or something like that, and then I can just add some fake mock data. And what I can do then, because a lot of people use Storybook just for visual presentation of their components, I use it for visual regression testing and personal workflows, because I like to develop my components without having them in the application, so that I know that they're in a nice isolated environment. And then I create a few versions of the component with different types of inputs, so that I can do a visual regression test. And that's usually just the visual regression runner. It's going to just crawl the Storybook's website and take a snapshot and do a pixel diff between like the various components that you have, so that you can check if your CSS is still working, because that's a dimension that unit testing isn't really good at, because as you can imagine, the CSS has that nasty little thing that it can do, where it can completely break your website by just having a selector that makes cursors not work or moves an element off the screen or stuff like that, and that can be really basically impossible to figure out in a unit testing environment, and that's why I usually use a visual regression test for that. And then at the top layer, I usually put a runner like Cypress or something similar to that. Like, you can use Playwright as well, but Cypress is the one that most people feel comfortable with, at least in my part of the world. And the reason why I want to use that is because, like, if I've tested all my components and I make sure that the CSS styling is working for them, then I'm not so concerned about the web page themselves. But what I do want is just to try to click through the application, do like a basic end-to-end test, where I just simulate going to all the navigation menus, making sure that I see the right page, and if I go to something that is not supposed to be, that the 404 page is showing properly, like the basic application operations are working. And that's what I call a basic smoke test, and that is something that is much easier to do in Cypress. So that's my basic setup, and I can tell you that if you know those tools, you will be pretty much set, at least testing wise, for most jobs that you're going to find out in the wild. There are like things like BDD and more advanced things, but that's the basics for the front end. Backend is very similar. The difference here is that, well, it depends on your language, right? So if we go with something like C#, XUnit, like having something like running like unit test and so forth is a given. And then like mock is the library that I prefer to use for mocking and stubbing and stuff like that, because that's a pretty important part as well. And then I like to, depending now on how complex the application is, because usually I use test containers for just running like databases and stuff like that, because I don't really like mocking off like my DAOs and stuff like that. It's easy to just use them directly. I only mock them if I know that like the serialization and deserialization has been confirmed somewhere else, and then I can mock off the DB context in this situation, or like the interface for the repository basically, and focus my business logic in just unit tests and stuff like that. But if we were to go even further than that, something that I think is vastly underused is contract-based testing, which I'm a big fan of. If I'm building something that is more complicated than a standard client server type of thing, if it's a one-to-one mapping between the server and the client, I might skip it because it's like so trivial because I'm controlling both sides of the interface, right? But if I have more than one, like if I'm making like an API or something like that for external users, I always try to add some contract testing in there. The favorite tool for the industry to use for that sort of stuff is, at the moment, as far as I know, Pact. I personally don't like Pact all that much. Like I feel like it's easier for me to just do my own contract test, like write them myself. But it's something that at least I mean, I don't see a lot of people using it, so take what I'm saying here with a little bit of pinch of salt, because usually you're going to be fine with just having a unit test running a mocking library of some sort, test containers and so forth. For like that's 90% of the time all the testing you need to do, and then of course you can consider things like load testing and so forth and so forth. The most important thing that I suggest that you do, though, if you want to take into account like security and stuff like that, is to make sure that you think a little bit about the tests that you write. I always like to have one test file for like when I hit endpoints and logic and stuff like that, so that just checks that like the functionality of my API is working, and then I have one test that just checks that the contract is correct. That's my contract test. I make sure that the headers are there, like that they're set correctly and so forth, and then the endpoints are returning what's expected from the like I use OpenAI specifications for most things, as most people do. So what I do is like I just take the specification and I look at the specification. I don't look at the code. I look at the specification and then I write the test from the perspective of the specification. That way I know if I create a breaking change somewhere in my tests, right? Or in my application, because those tests are there to test the interface, not the implementation. And then I do the same thing for security. I have like a file for just security checks, like everything from trying to, do database queries that are too big, or use values that are not like correct, or trying to do things like getting access to other users, entities in the system and stuff like that. So what I want you to take away from this is that the major tools that, well, at least I use, and quite a lot of people are using in the web space, who, if you want to do front end or back end or like full stack, is first and foremost some type of unit test runner, XUnit or JUnit on Java. Like there's like every language is different in the back end. Have some notion of how to do integration testing. Test containers for backend is pretty nice. I really enjoy it. It's easier to work with than Docker Compose and stuff like that, but there you go. And then you might consider doing contract testing if you're really inclined to do so. Then in the front-end space, it's also unit test runners such as Vite with vtest, or Jest, or Mocha, Karma. It goes on. It depends on the specific stack, right? And then use something like visual regression testing that just helps you do like a pixel diff. Like me, as I said, if you're like a full organization, you might want to use a service for it, or like if it's you like me, I might just, honestly, some guys, it's pretty much as easy as just spinning up like a headless browser and crawling all the websites and then saving like snapshot comparisons between the various pages. But there are tools for that as well that you can use. Loki was the one that I was using until very recently. And then on top of that, I like to use Cypress for end-to-end tests to just make sure that the user flows are working and basic operations are working and pages are like showing correctly and loading and so forth. And you can I try to use that for local development, but I also really like to run it in test environments or in production if at all possible. I would say that if you know these sort of things and you remember what I was saying about the testing pyramid, because all the tools I was talking about, it starts at the bottom layer and it works as well up all the way up to Cypress and sort of where at the highest levels where manual testing and larger scope testing is happening, then you should be pretty set, I would say. There are other forms of testing that you can learn about, but these are the main ones that would be like absolute core to what you need if you want to do serious web development today at the very least. Have a great day.